Vicky, and this is the second and final part of my series on how to make a strapless dress. In this video I'm going to show you how I add the layers of tulle to the skirt and join the skirt and bodice, how I join the lining and outside together, and then how I embellish the bodice with lace and crystals. To add the tulle to the skirt of this dress, I'm going to be using the same method as I used to make the skirt that went with the Fortuna gown. So if you haven't seen that video, go and watch that first, or if you watch this video and you're confused, go and watch this video because it will give you more insight and more detail about how I do it. But I don't want this dress to be as big and puffy as this. This one's got a huge petticoat underneath it as well. And this one had 10 layers of tulle. For this dress, I'm only going to add 4, maybe 5 layers, but probably 4 layers. I want it nice and puffy, but not nearly this puffy. This skirt's nice and full, so I do have the option to put a petticoat underneath it if I want to. I also don't want it to be one length at the bottom like the Fortuna skirt is, so I'm going to cut each layer progressively shorter to give a layered effect, so I don't hide too much of the sparkle of the purple sequins at the hem. I'm going to be using this extra wide black tulle. This is 108 inches wide. I buy mine from fabric.com. I'll put a link down in the description. But if you Google extra wide tulle, you'll be able to find this in all sorts of colours from different suppliers. I want my finished length to be 45 inches and I'm going to start this layer 10 inches down from the waist. So I'm going to cut 4 35-inch pieces from my tulle bolt. So I'm going to measure 35 inches this way and cut across. And then I'm going to join them all together to make one big circle. These are my 4 35-inch pieces of tulle joined together to make a huge circle. So next I'm going to put it over the dress with the seams on the inside, so the seams facing in towards the skirt. I've marked 10 inches down from the waist all the way around. The first thing I'm going to do is pin the seams on the tulle to the side front and side back seams of the skirt. Next I can find the centre of each section of tulle and pin that to the centre front, side seams and centre back. And from there I can gather it all up and stitch it on. Oh, got a stray crystal stuck to it there. Don't know where that's come from. Oh, it's black. I'll save that for the bodice. So this is my first layer of tulle all stitched on, and I've marked where my next layer is going to go, which is 2.5 inches above it. And I'm going to cut it 5 inches shorter than this one, plus the fact that we're doing it 2.5 inches higher means it'll be about 7.5 inches shorter to start creating that layered effect that I want. And I'm going to do the same until I reach the waist, so 2.5 inches higher and 5 inches shorter than the previous layer. I'm actually going to end up with 5 layers all together, so I've got one at 10 inches, 7.5 inches, 5 inches, 2.5 inches, and then one right at the top of the waist that will get stitched into the seam when I join the bodice on. This is my second layer cut and joined and pinned on, ready to gather and sew. But this time this layer is going across the opening in the back where the zip's going to be. So I'm going to zoom the camera in and show you how I do that part. Okay, you can see here that the tulle is going over the centre back opening for the zip. Now I don't want to stitch the tulle in with the zip because it holds it flat. I want it to puff up. So what I do, this isn't on a seam. This is the centre of one of the pieces of tulle. So I cut down to the width of the opening. And then I take the edge of the tulle and I fold the edge under, and I'm going to pin it on just past my seam allowance for the zip. So that's the edge of the tulle there. If the zip goes in at 1.5 centimetres, by the time that's in and folded back, the tulle will sit like this and it will sit over it. So it means once the zip's in, the zip will sit neatly in the sequins, but the tulle will lift up over it. And even if there's a few mils between the edge of the zip and the tulle, by the time we've got all the gathers and all the layer, it won't notice. So this is how the skirt is looking with all 5 layers of the tulle sewn on. I'm really pleased with the amount of fullness at the top, and I love this layered look. I'm still not sure if I'm going to put a petticoat underneath it. I think I quite like it like this as it gets slimmer at the bottom and keep the bulk of the puffiness at the waist here. So you can see at the centre back how all the layers stop next to where the zip's going to get sewn in. So once that's sewn in like this, those layers will finish right on the edge of the zip, and you can see once it's together and all of these stand up, it's going to hide that join in the zip really nicely. So the next job I'm going to do is join the skirt to the bodice. So I'm going to pin it right sides together exactly like I did for the lining and stitch along my seam allowance. I've got the bodice joined onto the skirt now. For this half I'm going to have the seam allowance going down towards the skirt because it's quite bulky and it will hide underneath all those layers we've got there. I'm going to clip it at the back just to make it narrower and a bit thinner, and then I'm going to stitch my zip in, and I'm using a black concealed zip. And as I stitch it, I'm just going to be careful that I don't catch any of the tulle layers in, because we want it to sit sort of neatly next to all of those layers once it's sewn. When I'm stitching invisible zips into dresses like this, because of the sequins and because of this big waist seam, it can be a little tricky to do up, but I like how they look, so I tend to sew just a little bit further away from the teeth than I would if I was putting it in just, say, a satin dress. So even though you might just see it a little bit more, I think that's a better compromise than putting a regular dress zip in, which shows up a lot more. My zip's in, and you can see I've left it showing a little bit more than normal. That's because it's ended up quite chunky with all the layers of tulle and sequins that I've used, and it just means that I'm going to be able to get it past that seam at the waist. So if you're just using satin or a much finer fabric, you can just sew your invisible zip in as normal so it's hidden completely. I'm also not worried because I'm going to be adding black lace and crystals to this, so once everything's on there you're not even going to notice it. So now the two halves are completely together and finished. The next thing is to join them together. So to join the outside and the lining, I'm going to pin them right sides together around the top. So just making sure I line up that centre front and that I line up the seams. Once I've pinned all the way around, I'm going to stitch my seam allowance all the way around. I normally sew with the boning upwards, so with the lining up, just so that I can check that I'm not going to hit any of my bones as I join it. Once you've stitched your seam allowance, you then need to trim along the top. I trim to about this, which is about 5mm. And then in the centre front, if you've done a sweetheart neckline, you want to go down as close as you can to the point at the centre front. Next, I've opened my dress up, so I've got my right sides on the outside, and the next job is to understitch along the top of where the bodice pieces are joined. So this tulle works out the way. So I'm going to stitch along here on the lining side, holding that seam allowance that we've trimmed towards the lining side, so it's all going to be held that way. When I get to the centre front, so the V of my sweetheart, I'm going to stop the understitching about 5mm either side of that V. So this is what my finished understitching looks like. It can be quite tricky to get it under the machine, so just go as far as you can. If you can't get all the way along, it doesn't really matter, but it's good if you can. Mine's a little bit uneven because it was so hard because I've had so much fabric, but it'll do the job. So next, I can now turn it all in the right way. So I'm going to push that lining through to the inside. So this is the dress all in the right way. I've put some pins just around the top until I press it just to hold the lining down and make sure everything's okay. And then I've just hand sewn down the inside of the zip, but only to just below the waist seam because I still want to get inside to be able to do that bag hem. So I've just hand stitched down to there for now. I'm really happy with how it's all sitting together. And my waist seams line up nicely. And my centre top sits really nicely as well. I might put a hook on there. I'll see how it looks when it's on. Next, I want to make sure that the bodice doesn't ride up, so the lining doesn't pop out at the top here. So what I do is I line up the seams, and I just use my machine to do a couple of stitches here. I can do that on this dress because it's going to be hidden by the lace, and because my machine's strong enough to go through all those layers as well. If you're worried about your stitching showing, or if your machine's probably not going to go through the layers, you can do a couple of hand stitches really carefully, just coming up through the seam so you don't see them, or you can go inside and catch the two layers together from the inside. So I'm going to do just a few machine stitches at the top of the side back side and the side front seam as well. Once I've done that, I'm going to give it a really good press around the top. This is the top of the dress all finished, so I've just done a few stitches down each seam just to hold the lining down, make sure it's not going to ride up, and you know, sometimes, especially at the bust seam, you end up with the lining lumping out over the top, and I hate that, so that will stop that happening. It also means that when the hanging loops are on the hanger, the inside's not going to pull up, and because of the sequence in the tulle, you can't even see the stitches on the outside. I've also pressed it all the way along, which has just finished that top really nicely. So next at the waist, the seam allowance with all the tulle kept wanting to come up and show on the bodice. So I've pinned through all the layers at the waist, and I'm just going to do some hand stitches all the way along. It's going to be too hard to get that under the machine to hold things down. So I'm just going to do a few hand stitches all the way along, which will hold that seam allowance where I want it to be. And also it'll help just keep these panels smooth. So it's going to hold that layer down and stop these wrinkling when it's on. The same at the front, it will stop this part lifting up and getting some wrinkles on it. So again, it's just another little detail that gives you a nicer finish. And you might find at this point that your lining's a tiny bit longer than your outside layer because of the way it turns over at the top, but I think that's a good thing because again it means the bones go just below the seam here, which is another way of keeping this layer smooth. If your bones stop before the waist here, you can end up with that sort of puckering of the fabric at the bottom. Next, I've just put my dress on inside out on my dress form so that I can pin and cut the hem ready to sew it. Next, I'm going to be doing the hem, and I'm going to do a bag hem. So I've gone around and I've joined with the dress on inside out on the mannequin. I've joined all the seams together just with a pin. Then I'm going to measure down from the waist seam the length that I want my hem plus my seam allowance. And I'm going to mark that with a pin all the way around. Then once I've measured and put my pins in all the way around, I'm going to cut off the excess up to where the pins are. Being careful not to cut my tulle underneath. So I've cut my hem all the way around and I've just left the pins in the seams for now. To sew the hem, I'm going to go in through the opening we left at the centre back seam of the lining, and I'm going to grab one of the pins and I'm going to pull the hem up through that hole. Then where I've got these two pinned together, I'm going to take that pin out and then flip this so that they are right sides together and repin them. Leaving the pins in means you don't get confused and end up sewing the wrong seams together. Then I'm going to pull the next pin through and turn them so that they're right sides together. And then I can pin along in between. So I'm going to go ahead and do that the whole way around the hem, and then I'm going to stitch my 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now I've sewn all around my hem, I can pull it all back through to the right side. You can see that's how it looks on the right side. So the last jobs I've got to do for actually constructing this dress is I need to stitch up the gap in the centre back seam and finish sewing it down to the zip, and I need to press the hem. So I'm going to do that, then I'll pop it back on my dress form and show you how it's looking. So here is the finished dress on the inside. I always try and make sure my insides look as neat and finished as my outsides. And here's how it looks in the right way on my dress form. It's a bit big for my dress form, which is why it looks a bit baggy at the front, but once there's somebody inside it, it'll be fine. If you're leaving your dress plain, then at this point you are all finished and it's ready to wear. I, however, am going to be adding some lace and some crystals to the bodice of this one. To embellish the bodice of the dress, I'm going to use this black beaded lace that I had in my stash. I'm going to cut it up and pin it on and then hand sew it on with black thread. I won't go into huge detail about how I do this because I do already have a video about how I cut an applique lace, and I'll link to that in the description. After the lace is all sewn on, then I'm going to add some of these flat back black crystals, and I'll be putting them on with E6000 Fabrifuse. This is my new favourite thing. If you've watched my old videos, I used to use a gem glue, but since Jazida got me onto this, this is what I use now. And I also use this wax pencil, which makes things a bit quicker instead of the tweezers that I used to use. So, first thing I'm going to do is work out where I want the lace to go. Okay, so I'm happy with the lace placement. So I'm going to cut it out neater and even it up as I sew it on. So that's the back. And the front. So I'm just going to go ahead and stitch that on, trim it and stitch it on with black thread now. So I'm really happy with how the lace and the crystals are looking. It's really sparkly, but I've decided it just needs a bow in the front. So my daughter has drawn a bow for me to check the size and cut it out of calico. So I'm just going to pin that on. And I think that bigger side is what we need. So I'm going to do it about 7 inches wide. And this end about 4 inches, and I'm going to make it from this piece of black velvet. This is from a vintage dress that I altered last year, and I kept this piece of velvet because it's so beautiful, and I think it will be the perfect finishing touch to this dress. This is the shape from my bow made from the velvet. So all I've done is sewn 2 pieces of the velvet right sides together and turn them the right way out. So I've ended up with it, yeah, 7 inches. That middle part is 3 inches, and then the edge pieces are actually about 4.5. So next I'm just going to cut some more velvet to go around the centre. Then I'll gather this part up and wrap that around the middle and stitch it on, and we're finished. So this is the dress completely finished with all the embellishments on. Hopefully the camera will pick up just how sparkly it is on the bodice and the sequins coming through the tulle as well. So while I've done a really embellished dress with all the layers on the skirt, with everything I've used, and with my choice of the sequin fabric as well. You can use this technique to create a dress that is as plain or as fancy as you want. So you can choose whatever fabrics, embellishments, skirt shapes that suit your style. I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you do make something using my tutorials or any of my tutorials, I'd love to see what you create. Come and share it with me on my Facebook group, the link's in the description, or come and tag me on Instagram or Facebook and show me what you've made. Please subscribe if you haven't already and click the little bell so you get notified of when I upload a new video. And thanks for watching. I'll be back soon with some more videos and tutorials.